although the man's look and appearance was quite scary. But the look of his red eye with a scar made goosebumps run through his body. It turned out that he was not as angry as he seemed at first glance. He sat up on the bed holding his head and remarked that time was flying fast since today was the initiation ceremony for the newcomers. He added that they didn't have to be so nice to him, he wasn't a professor, and after all, he was a freshman like them. Dick was still scared and hid behind Simon, who came closer to the bed and agreed, but made another mistake and called his new roommate Mr. Kizen. He told him to drop it and just call him Kizen. He turned to them and told them that he didn't know how long they would be staying at this school, but they should remember two things. The first thing was to keep their noses out of his business. The second thing was not to make any noise or fuss until he went to bed, and once he was asleep, they could dance, sing, or do whatever they wanted. But Kizen still hadn't answered whether he allowed them to stay here, so Simon asked if they could stay. Kizen replied that it didn't matter, did it? Someone would come here anyway when there were no more rooms, so they should stay. And he immediately dozed off under their astonished gazes. Simon confidently told the dormitory manager that they were taking the room. She couldn't quite believe it, so she asked if they were sure they would be okay. Simon was sure that they would be fine, because it seemed that their neighbor was not as bad as they had heard about him, although he looked a bit rough. The dormitory manager agreed and just warned them that if they had any problems later, they shouldn't hesitate to let her know. She would then immediately notify the head manager of the dormitories to take care of it. Simon was very grateful to this girl for her concern. They said goodnight and closed the door behind them in their new room 409 with a creak. Dick asked if he really thought their neighbor would not wake up. Simon wasn't sure, but he had just told them to do whatever they wanted as long as he was asleep. So Dick decided to check it out. He threw the stack of books he was holding and they hit the floor very loudly, scaring Simon. And it turned out that Kizen was indeed still sleeping despite the noise. Dick was beginning to like him, and he said that in the end he didn't think Kizen was a bad person, as long as they followed his rules they had nothing to worry about. And since they had found their room and moved their stuff, it was time to take a shower. He had seen the bathhouse on the second floor on their way up and he was going to check it out. Simon asked quite cautiously, "A bath?" A minute later he was already shouting in excitement how much he loved her, and it was obvious because he was beaming with happiness. He had never felt so warm and soft. As they walked back together from the bath, Dick was surprised that he had never seen anyone so enthusiastic about an ordinary shower stall. He asked Simon with a smile if he had ever lived far away in the mountains or something similar. Simon replied that yes, something like that. Dick continued to talk and asked him to at least stop saying, "Wow," every time he pressed the buttons in the shower. Other students would not understand this behavior. Simon asked if he really did that. Dick assured him that he was, and now the whole school would not only be talking about him as special submission number 1, but now he would be called a bumpkin on top of being called a fake. Simon was ashamed of this prospect. They went into their room talking about how good it was to be in Kizen and how lucky they were to be here. They probably all wanted to be here. But whether or not they could stay here depended on their grades. Simon had heard that only 300 or so students in their second year were supposed to stay. Dick said that this was true. There are so many cohorts of students now only because there is still a period of student protection and they just have to wait a little bit and they will see at least half of the students drop out right away. But Simon didn't know what the protection period meant, so he asked what it was. Dick explained to him that it is a period when professors cannot officially evaluate students and give them grades. During this period professors cannot personally communicate with students and they cannot expel students at their discretion. They also can't harm students, and there are so many other things that are forbidden, he can't remember them all. Simon was shocked by this information, so he was still being lenient in everything that happened today. What would happen next? Dick continued that after this period, expulsions would be a constant occurrence due to lack of academic performance, lack of visibility of future success, rule violations, unsatisfactory homework, and other lesser reasons. But, if he can hang in there at least until the end of his first year, he can expect to find a job almost anywhere in the future. And if he can survive the intense competition and officially graduate, then he will be a leader in an era that will move entire continents. And Dick pointed his finger directly at the surprised Simon. Then he added that he would be able to become absolutely anything, except a member of the royal family. Although in fact, some small kingdom might offer him a princess to marry if he could graduate from Kizen. Simon heard this and asked if he wanted to become a nobleman. Dick replied that no, although there would be many advantages if he were one, it was not his goal. Simon then clarified his question, what then is his goal? Dick held up his hand and showed him how he rubbed his fingers in a well-known gesture. Money, that was his main and probably only goal. Simon now had an idea of what lay ahead and was serious about working hard to stay in Kizen as long as possible. He started rubbing his ring that Lorraine had bought him. Dick had already started to say that if he ever needed money, he would. When suddenly Simon opened his subspace and a box with a set of dice flew out, surprising and maybe even scaring his friend a little. The latter was amazed and did not hesitate to show it. He just bombarded Simon with questions. What is this? And how did he just do that? Simon explained that it was subspace. And in his hands he was holding a skeleton kit for an island ratman. He had bought it when he was shopping with Lorraine. Now he was going to practice to catch up with the other students who were taking the preparatory courses. Dick couldn't believe that he was going to practice after they had just come from class, and Simon replied that he just didn't want to forget everything he had learned and experienced today in summonology class. Then he asked that this time he was going to put it together in the right order this time, right? But Simon replied that he wanted to try again, to trust his gut feeling this time. He began to assemble the bone by bone, following his gut instinct. Dick watched him fascinated. A few minutes later, another unusual skeleton Simon had assembled was walking across the floor. Dick looked at it and noted that it was the same as the one he had collected in the classroom. Simon replied that yes, in general it was the same, but it should have been better, because he spent more time on it, but one of its legs was wobbly for some reason. Despite the fact that it was a skeleton, it was even somewhat cute. Dick said that despite his shortcomings, Simon had made a skeleton that he probably would never be able to. Simon apologized to his incomprehensible creature, who was looking at him questioningly. And the next moment he broke it into its component parts with a crunch. His friend was very surprised by this behavior. He asked what was wrong. It was such a beautiful skeleton, why did he destroy it? Simon did not answer, absorbed in his thoughts, and this made Dick worry about him. He was absorbed in the memories of today's summoning class, recalling the words of Professor Aaron, who said that skeletons formed with summoning magic have a tendency to take their original form, and showed how easily two bones can be joined as if by attraction. The official name for this phenomenon is restoring force. Simon also remembered that this phenomenon was also called the attraction in the field. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and focused on his inner sense. And he began to clearly feel every bone scattered around the room. Nothing else mattered to him now. Because skeletons have a tendency to go back to their original form, so if he remembers the sequence, assembly shouldn't be hard. With a rattling sound, the bones that had been lying close to each other began to slowly move closer together. Simon looked closely at the skull, which was quietly clicking on the floor, and he had an idea. Instead of manually reassembling each bone by hand, he could simply use summoning magic to make them reassemble themselves to their original shape. So he stood up and pointed his hand at the pile of bones on the floor and said, "Restore." And in a moment, the skull's red eyes lit up and the whole room was filled with the sound of bones breaking. Dick was a little scared as the bones started flying by him with a whistle. A minute later, with the last snaps and clicks, the whole island ratman was on the floor of the room. Dick remarked that it was incredible to see the skeleton put itself together, and Simon was pleased that he could entertain his friend a little. Meanwhile, Ratman was running and jumping around the room. Dick was very sleepy and yawning, but he still wanted to know how Simon could do it even without training. But eventually sleep overcame his curiosity. He told Simon that it was late and he was very sleepy, he should go to bed. Then he asked Simon if he was going to sleep, but he couldn't get enough of his summon. He kept petting his Ratman and said that he wanted to try it out more. Dick didn't mind and he would just go to bed first. But before he went to bed, Simon managed to ask him what time was their first class tomorrow. Dick asked again, "Tomorrow?" And he immediately answered, "Darkness Dynamics." While they were talking, Simon was stroking his skeleton and his eyes changed from red to midnight blue. Dick had long since fallen asleep, and Simon was still sitting on the floor studying the diagram, his skeleton sitting across from him, tapping its bones softly. Simon was wondering how he could connect the bones so that the knees could rotate, although they might be Ratman's bones, but maybe they could move like human bones if he put them in a different order. He held one of the bones in his hands and thought about what to do with it. But after twisting the bone in his hands, he came to the conclusion that it wouldn't. Just putting the Ratman's inverted joint. The other way around wouldn't work. He began to add and correct something in his notes. He wrote the following: "The assembly formulas are the standards that necromancers have established over a long time, so there must have been numerous trials and errors to get to this point. Just like he is now." Every task has its reason and meaning, and after repeating the assembly himself, he realized how great the previous generations of necromancers were. After the inspection, he put the skeleton's leg back in place. Then he added another arm, trying to replace number 25 with number 31. He asked his creatures if they were comfortable, to which they swung their heads in different directions. He realized that this combination was not very good and decided to put the bones back in their places. Then he thought that no matter how reasonable the structure is, there is always a more efficient way to assemble a motor mechanism for a skeleton. He wondered how he could learn all this quickly. He picked up the book and decided that he would research this question in more detail. He remembered his father, whose skeletons had helped people with their possessions. And Lorraine, whose skeletons had helped them deal with a gang that had attacked him. He looked at his rat man, whose eyes burned with blue darkness, and wondered what he was missing compared to his father and Lorraine. Simon just couldn't wait for his next summonology class to learn more. The next morning at the first class, the students were listening to a lecture on darkness dynamics. The professor stood in front of the class and told them how important darkness dynamics was to the students. The professor's name was Eric Ora, and he was the one who was going to teach the class. He was quite monotonous in his talk, which caused most of the students to doze off, but not Simon, who was listening intently. The professor asked a rhetorical question, so then how does this darkness create the miracle that is black magic? And went on to explain that to answer this question they needed to understand the flow of darkness, runic words, and the mechanisms of the magic circle. Professor Eric Ora decided to delve into history and explain to them the origin of runic words, which had its roots in the eternally burning torch of the Temple of Del. Initially, none of the ancient people wondered why this torch never went out, even though no one fed it with fuel. Simon was fascinated, while the other students were already falling asleep from boredom. The professor continued, telling them that the wizards and necromancers who discovered and researched the ancient runic words made countless improvements to create the modern runes of today. He began drawing runes and magic circles on the board, commenting that runic words after all the improvements today look like this, and these two magic circles are examples of how the improved runic words are used. This magic circle on the left that they saw could not have been activated. And the difference between it and that circle on the right, which can be activated, is how the runic words are used. Simon listened carefully and took notes. The professor continued, and the students took notes that thanks to the corrective devices they used they had the ability to use the darkness more freely and quickly even without training. Finally, the boring lecture was over and the professor put the piece of chalk back, but before all the students left, he gave them a homework assignment to do before the next class. The assignment was as follows: they had to use one of the magic circles that could not be activated that were demonstrated for them as an example and then provide possible ways to modify it, with the corresponding calculations and formulas they used to make those circles work. The bell rang to announce the end of the lesson. And the teacher said that in the next class he would call 3 students to present their assignments. And he said goodbye to them, saying that he was looking forward to seeing them next time. After the lesson was over, Simon and Dick went outside on their way to the next class, which was to be held outdoors. They complained to each other about how difficult darkness dynamics was. Dick compared it to the arithmetic he learned with his father, wondering why he couldn't just memorize a formula, but had to understand the principles. However, Simon noted that it wasn't so bad. Although he didn't understand more than half of it, he liked the way the professor described everything in order, starting with the principles. Dick countered that he just loves everything about Kizen. Even this morning, when he was admiring the soap in the bathroom, Simon hit his friend on the shoulder for this remark. The island looked incredible in the sunshine as our friends walked farther and farther away from the school buildings. As they walked across the dandelion-filled meadow, Dick asked Simon what class they were going to. Simon replied that they were going to a magic combat class. When they arrived at the clearing where their lesson was to take place, the professor was nowhere to be seen and they were beginning to have doubts about whether they had come to the right place. When Jamie Victoria pointed somewhere to the side, attracting the attention of everyone present. A cloud of dust was approaching them with a thud and they did not understand who or what it could be and why the ground was shaking so much. A flock of creatures was running toward them. It turned out that it was a whole flock of hippos running right at the frightened students. The frightened students gathered in a circle and trembled as the pack of hippos surrounded them and ran around. The students did not understand what was happening and where the hippos came from. But suddenly someone from the middle of the pack greeted them. A guy was sitting on one of the hippos and he told them that Professor Homping would be teaching his class today in the Roque Mountains. So they all had to get on the hippos to get there quickly.